Nobody in that ballroom knew her name, and nobody bothered to ask. 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, and the only one who'd come by city bus was a 35-year-old piano teacher standing near the back wall, waiting to accept an award she'd never asked for. She was small and quiet, her dark hair pulled back low, and down the left side of her face and across her left hand ran burn scars she'd carried for years. People noticed them, then they looked away. She was used to that. What she wasn't used to was a hand closing hard around her arm, or the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, while a diamond necklace she'd never touched was announced missing to the entire room. The officer didn't check the cameras. He didn't ask for a witness. He didn't ask her name. Nobody had told him to arrest her. That part was his own idea, made the second he heard her name spoken over the phone, because that name belonged to a night he'd spent years trying not to remember. So he did what frightened men do. He said something about her face that made 300 people go completely silent, and not one of them, not a single one, spoke up for her. Her award hit the marble floor and somebody stepped on it, and that quiet woman, who'd spent most of her life keeping her chin down, lifted her head for the first time in years and looked straight at every face that turned away. Here's the question that officer never thought to ask. Who does a woman like that go home to? Because the man waiting for her was 37 years old. He never raised his voice, and he'd never had to. Grown men stood when he walked into a room and stayed standing until he told them to sit. For 4 generations, his family had held the docks, the freight lines, and half the construction on the south side of the city. And in all that time, there'd been exactly one rule nobody had ever broken. That night, she made one phone call. It lasted 7 words. And by midnight, 47 black cars were parked along both ends of the street outside that precinct. Engines off, headlights on, nobody stepping out, nobody saying a word. If you love stories about quiet dignity and justice that finally arrives, hit that like button for us. Share this with someone who believes a person deserves to be asked their name before they're judged. And subscribe so you don't miss what we bring you next. Now let's go back to where it started, to a church basement on the south side, and a woman with scarred hands teaching a room full of children how to find Middle C. The basement of St. Bridget Church sat at the bottom of a hill on the south side of the city, and on Tuesday afternoons it was the noisiest place in the entire neighborhood. The Lyndale Community Center had borrowed the space years earlier, filling it with a few wooden tables, a cabinet of braille books, and an old piano whose ivory keys had faded to a creamy yellow. Rosalind Whitaker arrived half an hour before class as she always did, lifted the piano lid, wiped the dust from its surface, then sat down and adjusted the bench that someone somehow managed to lower all the way every single week. By the time the door opened and the first footsteps sounded on the stairs, she was already there with both hands resting on the keys. The children poured in, each in their own particular way, one holding onto another's shoulder, white canes tapping against the concrete floor, and almost immediately the familiar argument began. Everyone wanted the chair to her left. It was the chair closest to the window, where the afternoon sunlight came in, and the children told one another that, when you sat there, the piano sounded warmer. She let them argue for a little while before speaking in her gentle voice, saying that whoever's turn it was today already knew it, and the whole group burst into laughter, because every one of them insisted it was theirs. The lesson began the way every lesson did. She placed a little girl's right hand on the keys, guided her thumb to middle C, and told her to remember it not with her eyes but with the way it felt, that there was always a place in the middle of the piano to return to, and if she could find that place, she would never be lost. Rosalind said that almost every week, and the children knew it so well that one of them imitated her, stretching the words into a crooked little song that sent the whole room into laughter again. Rosalind laughed too. She laughed more in that room than anywhere else in her life. Here, no one looked at her and then turned away. Here, people knew her by her voice, by the way she tapped twice on the piano lid before beginning, by the smell of lemon soap on her sleeves, and not a single person in that room had ever seen her face. Perhaps that was why she had stayed so long. Halfway through the lesson, a boy of about 7 sitting in the back row suddenly spoke up, his voice piping through the room, and when Rosalind turned toward him, he asked a question no child in the class had ever asked before. He wanted to know what her face looked like. The room went quiet for a beat, not because anyone felt awkward, but because the other children were just as curious, and none of them had ever dared to ask. Rosalind let her hands rest on the keys. She thought for a moment, then told them that she had a large scar that ran across her face and down onto her hand, and that many adults, when they saw it, usually looked somewhere else. The little boy asked another question, his voice worried. asking whether that made her sad. She said no, then added something that every child in that class would remember afterward. She told them that a long time ago, she had traded her face for 2 things, and those 2 things were worth far more than her face had ever been, so when everything was counted, she had still come out ahead. None of the children asked what those 2 things were. Children have a wisdom of their own. They know when to stop, and the little boy only nodded, told her not to be sad anymore, then demanded that she continue teaching the piece from the week before. At the end of class, the center director came down the stairs carrying a thick envelope made from expensive paper, with the name Ashford Foundation embossed in the corner. It was an invitation to a fundraising evening at the Caraway Hotel, and her name was printed clearly inside, along with a line respectfully inviting her to come forward and accept the Volunteer of the Year award. Rosalind held the letter, read it once, then started to fold it back up and return it. She said she wasn't comfortable in places like that she was grateful for the funding the center would receive, but someone else could go on stage, anyone at all, as long as it wasn't her. But the children had heard, and the children begged. They told her she had to go, that she had to wear something beautiful, that she had to come back and tell them what was inside, whether there was a piano, whether the piano was bigger than theirs. One child said that if people were giving her an award, then it meant they knew she was a good person, and that made the whole class look good too. Rosalind sat in silence for a long time amid all those bright, chattering voices. Then she folded the letter, slipped it into her coat pocket, and said all right. She would go. She would go for them, not for herself. About 2.5 miles away, above an old restaurant that had been closed for years in Bridgeport, there was a room very few people in the city were ever allowed to enter, and those who had entered never spoke about it afterward. There was nothing remarkable about the room itself. A long wooden table, several chairs lined against the wall, a lamp hanging low from the ceiling. But that afternoon, 4 men were standing inside, and not one of them sat down, even though empty chairs were directly behind them. They stood because Elias Marchetti hadn't told them to sit. He was seated at the head of the table, the sleeves of his shirt neatly rolled up, a thin file of papers in front of him. The man standing in the middle of the room was a contractor with salt and pepper hair, sweat gathering at his temples, even though the room wasn't warm. He had been awarded the framing contract for one of the family's projects west of the harbor, and for months he had been switching the materials, using cheaper ones and pocketing the difference. Elias didn't ask whether he had done it. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten him. He didn't stand up. He simply opened the file, looked down at it once, then spoke exactly 4 sentences, his voice so quiet that the men standing against the wall had to hold their breath to hear him clearly. He said he knew what the man had done. He said he also knew why he had done it, and that the reason wasn't as terrible as the man thought. He said people would eventually live in that building, and at night they would sleep beneath the frame he had built. Then he said the final thing, that the man should go home, sit down, and think for himself about what kind of building he would want his own children to live in. The contractor opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, but no sound came out. He nodded several times in quick succession, turned, and walked out. And in the hallway, Emmett Cross heard the man's keys fall to the floor twice before he managed to pick them up. Once the door had closed, Emmett stepped inside and asked how Elias wanted to handle it. Elias closed the file, pushed it aside, and said to let the man wait. Let him go home, eat dinner with his wife, lie down, and fail to sleep. Then he would come back on his own. Maybe next week, maybe in 10 days, but he would come back, and when he did, everything would be easier for everyone. Emmett nodded. He had been with Elias for nearly a decade, and he knew his employer rarely needed to say anything twice. That same evening, Elias stood in a kitchen so narrow that taking half a step backward would put his back against the refrigerator, his sleeves rolled high, chopping onions. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building in Bridgeport, with a narrow hallway, wooden stairs that creaked beneath every step, and a kitchen window that looked directly onto the brick wall of the building next door. A pot of water was boiling on the stove, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the room, and in the corner of the living room, pushed against the wall, stood an old piano covered with a cloth, its lid closed, never once opened since the day it had been carried upstairs. Rosalind came home just after dark. She hung her coat on the hook, placed the invitation on the table, and sat in the only chair in the kitchen, watching her husband cook. They had married more than a year earlier, early one morning in a small chapel, with only the 2 of them and an elderly priest whose hands trembled so badly that he dropped the registry book. There had been no photographs, no guests, not a single line in any newspaper. She had refused to use his last name on any document that could become public. She had refused personal security. She had refused money, refused a larger house, even refused the car he had bought for her and eventually had to sell again. He had never argued with her about any of it, because he understood why, and the reason hurt him more than it irritated him. She told him that all her life people had stared at her because of her face, and she didn't want to grow old only to have them start staring at her because of the name standing behind her. That night she told him about the invitation, about how she had planned to refuse, and about how the children had begged her to go. He listened to all of it without interrupting, then wiped his hands on a towel, walked over to her, and pinned a small silver swallow brooch to her collar. He told her to wear it, not because it was expensive, but because it belonged to him, and that way, no matter where she stood in that room, a part of him would be standing beside her. She smiled, and she didn't take it off. Late that night, when Elias stepped out into the dark hallway, Emmett was already waiting at the top of the stairs, and he asked whether they should put more people around her. Elias stopped. He turned his head toward the door that had just closed behind him, stayed silent for a moment, then said very quietly that she didn't want that, so he would do something she didn't need to know about. Then he walked down the stairs, and Emmett followed without asking another question. The following evening, Rosalind caught the last bus of the afternoon from the end of the street in Bridgeport. Sitting in the row near the rear door as she always did, her faded cloth purse resting on her lap, and the small silver swallow brooch pinned neatly at her collar. The bus let her off some distance from the Caraway Hotel, and she walked the rest of the way, passing a line of gleaming black cars waiting for the doormen to open their doors. That was where she saw him, right beside the entrance to the parking lot. A man around 30 years old in a dark coat stood leaning against a lamppost, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away the way a stranger normally would. He only lowered his head slightly. Rosalind stopped in the middle of the walkway. She had seen that face before. She was certain of it. She had seen him at the bus stop on mornings when she left early for work, on the corner across from the community center on Tuesday afternoons, in the last row of a diner where she sometimes sat alone. For months, she had told herself it was coincidence. She walked toward him and asked his name. He said people called him Bishop. She asked how long he had been following her, and he fell silent, which was answer enough. She wasn't angry. She only felt something rise inside her that was both warm and weary. The feeling of someone who had just discovered that she was being loved in exactly the way she had repeatedly said she didn't need. Then she told him that tonight he was staying outside. Bishop started to object, but she continued, her voice still gentle, and yet leaving no room for argument, saying that this was a charity event for the children, that inside were people who would be writing checks so her center wouldn't have to close, and she didn't want a man carrying a gun standing at the door while they did it. She told him to remain in the parking lot. She would come back out in 2 hours. Bishop looked at her for a long time, then nodded, stepped back, and remained where he was. He had been told to listen to her. Before walking through the revolving doors, Rosalind did something she had done for years, a habit so small that no one ever noticed it. She took out her phone, pressed record, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. She didn't think anything would happen that night. She simply did it whenever she entered a room full of strangers. Inside, the grand ballroom of the Caraway Hotel glittered beneath crystal lights and was crowded with people whose names regularly appeared on the financial pages of the local newspaper. Rosalind remained close to the back wall for most of the evening, holding a glass of water, speaking to no one, and no one spoke to her. Close to 9 o'clock, the host announced her name, and she walked onto the stage to the polite applause of the room. Her thank you was very brief, only a few sentences, and she said that the money being raised that night wasn't for her. It was for a church basement on the south side of the city, where several children were learning to find Middle C with their fingertips. The room applauded again, and in the middle of that applause, at the second table from the stage, a man in his 60s named Harlan Voss went completely still. The wineglass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't clap. He didn't blink. He stared at the face of the woman standing on the stage, at the scar running along the left side of her face, and something drained every trace of color from his own face in less than 3 seconds. The person beside him asked whether he was all right. He didn't answer. He set the glass down, stood, walked straight toward the side corridor off the ballroom, and on the way he caught Corinne Ashford, the foundation president, by the elbow and pulled her along without saying a word. Once they reached a hidden stretch beneath the yellow lights of the carpeted hallway, Corinne pulled her arm free and demanded to know what was wrong with him. Voss didn't explain. He didn't say who that woman was, didn't say why he knew her, didn't say a single word about what had just gone through his mind. He only looked directly into Corinne's eyes and said that he needed the woman who had just stood on that stage to have no credibility left by Friday morning. Corinne laughed, thinking he was joking. Then she looked more closely at his face, and the smile disappeared. She asked what was happening before Friday. Voss replied only that it wasn't her concern, and that she owed him far too much to be allowed to ask. Corinne Ashford returned to the ballroom with her smile carefully placed back where it belonged, and it took her less than 10 minutes to think of a way. She wasn't evil in the way people usually imagine evil. She was simply a woman who was drowning. The Ashford Foundation had been insolvent for more than a year, expenses continuing to flow out steadily while incoming money slowly dried up, and the man who had quietly covered those shortfalls all that time was Harlan Voss. If he pulled his hand away, everything bearing her name would collapse within a week. So when he told her she had to do something, she had no right to ask why, and she didn't have enough courage to refuse. On the velvet-covered table near the entrance were several items for that night's auction, including a diamond necklace that Corinne herself had arranged to have brought over that afternoon. She walked around the table, paused for a beat, then turned to the ballroom manager and asked, in a voice just loud enough to carry, where the necklace had gone. The manager stared blankly at the empty patch of velvet. Corinne asked again, louder this time, and the nearest heads began to turn. That was all it took. The news spread through the ballroom faster than anything that could have been announced from the stage. No one shouted, no one pointed, no one said aloud what everyone was thinking. People simply began to look. 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, and their eyes, like water finding the lowest place, flowed steadily toward one single direction in the room, toward the back wall, where a small woman in a dark blue dress, bought from a consignment shop, stood alone, holding a glass of water, knowing no one, and having been introduced to no one. The only woman in the room whose name no one seemed to know. Rosalind felt it before she understood what was happening. She had lived with other people's eyes on her long enough to know every kind. There were the ones that looked and quickly turned away out of discomfort. There were the ones that lingered out of curiosity. And there were the ones that didn't move at all. The kind waiting to see what she would do next. Tonight it was the third kind. She set the glass of water down on the table behind her, let both arms fall naturally at her sides, and stayed exactly where she was. She didn't step forward to explain herself, because she knew very well that when someone like her began defending herself before anyone had even accused her, it only made her look more guilty. She didn't walk toward the door either, because she knew that if she left now, the entire room would take it as a confession. So she did what she had done for years whenever people looked at her that way. She stood still and waited for it to pass. Corinne watched from the other side of the ballroom and realized she didn't need to do anything else. She didn't say Rosalind's name. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply allowed the room to finish the work for her, and the room did it very well. Then she took out her phone, stepped back into the shadow beside a stone column, and called a familiar number. She knew there was always a patrol car parked outside during large events, and she knew the officer assigned to that district was an easy man to deal with, the kind who took extra off-duty work at gatherings like this. When he answered, Corinne kept it brief. She said there was a small situation inside the ballroom, that there was a guest who wasn't on the list making everyone uncomfortable, and that she wanted him to come in and escort the person out quietly. No scene, no attention, just get her through the door and outside. He asked for the guest's name. Corinne glanced down at the evening program in her hand, found the printed line naming the award recipient, and read it aloud. Rosalind Whitaker. Then she ended the call, adjusted her smile, and returned to her guests. She had no idea that on the other end of the line, after hearing that name, the man sitting inside the patrol car had gone completely still and remained silent for a very long time. Wade Pruitt had been sitting in that patrol car for nearly 2 hours, parked at an angle in the lot behind the Caraway Hotel, the same place he usually parked on nights when there was a large event. He had been a police officer for 16 years, and in all 16 of those years he had never been promoted beyond patrol. His disciplinary file was thick enough that no one bothered reading all the way through it anymore. Men who had joined the force nearly a decade after him now wore rank insignia and sat in air-conditioned offices, while he was still here, inside a car that smelled of cold coffee and warmed plastic seats, waiting for off-duty calls like this one so he could make a little extra money no one asked questions about. He liked those calls. They were simple. Someone got drunk. You walked them outside. Someone showed up without an invitation. You asked them to leave. When it was over, a thin envelope was slipped into your hand, and you went home and never thought about it again. When his phone vibrated and Corinne Ashford's number appeared on the screen, That was exactly the frame of mind in which he answered, one hand still holding a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold. The woman on the other end kept it brief. There was a small situation inside the ballroom. One of the guests was making people uncomfortable. All he needed to do was escort her out quietly. No scene, no attention. He listened, and in his mind he had already worked through the entire routine. He would go in, say a few words, walk back out with the person, and be home before midnight. Then he asked for the name. He asked only out of habit, because he needed something to write down, and for no other reason. The woman on the other end said it. Rosalind Whitaker. The coffee cup in Wade Pruitt's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. Something icy ran down his spine, from the base of his neck to the small of his back, quick and sharp, as though someone had suddenly thrown open the rear door of the patrol car, in the middle of a winter night. He said nothing. The woman asked if he was still there. He muttered something in reply, and ended the call, then sat motionless in the car, still holding the coffee cup, staring straight at the illuminated hotel sign ahead of him, without really seeing it. He knew that name. He couldn't remember the face, because over all those years he had written thousands of names into reports, and to him most faces eventually blurred into one another. But this name he knew. It was somewhere inside a yellowing file, on the third line, written in his own handwriting, from a night he had spent years training himself not to think about. There were mornings when he woke up, and that night simply didn't exist. There were entire years when he never touched it once inside his own mind, and yet all it took was one name spoken over the phone, and the whole thing rose back up intact. The smell of smoke, the sirens, the door, and the voice he had used to shout into the face of a 19-year-old girl that night. He sat there a while longer. Then he placed the coffee cup in the holder, and his hand trembled slightly as he did it. There was no thought of justice in his mind then, and no thought of a simply dressed woman standing in the wrong place inside an elegant room. There was only one question, repeating itself again and again. Did she still remember? And if she did, why had she appeared here after all these years, in this very city, during this very week, when for the past several weeks, people at the station had begun whispering that someone higher up had ordered certain old files pulled out and reviewed again? Wade Pruitt opened the patrol car door and stepped out, and he had already covered half the distance to the hotel entrance, when he realized he had no intention of simply asking anyone to leave. The woman had told him to get Rosalind out the door, but what good would that do? Outside the door she would still be out there, still free, still able to go anywhere she wanted, sit down in front of anyone she chose, and open her mouth to say whatever she knew. He needed more than that. He needed her somewhere where anything she said would no longer carry the same weight. And there was such a place. He knew it well. He had been taking people there for 16 years. All it took was a report. All it took was one line in a file, saying that this person had once been brought to the station in connection with stolen property at a charity event. And that would be enough. After that, anyone who heard her speak would think about her just a little differently. When Wade Pruitt walked through the revolving doors of the Caraway Hotel that night, he didn't enter with the contempt of a man coming to clean up someone else's problem. He entered with the fear of a man trying to seal shut a crack he had believed was buried for good. He moved across the glittering ballroom straight toward the back wall, where Rosalind stood alone in her dark blue dress. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't ask for a witness. He didn't even ask her name. Without a word of explanation, his hand closed hard around her arm, pulling her hands behind her back as the handcuffs clicked shut, while a diamond necklace she had never touched was announced missing to the entire room. Then, driven by the panic of a frightened man, he spoke loudly about her scarred face, a harsh, cruel remark that made 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns go completely silent. In the sudden stillness, her award slipped from her fingers, hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, and somebody stepped on it without looking down. Not a single person spoke up for her, but that quiet woman lifted her head and looked straight at every face that turned away as Pruitt marched her out toward the doors. The patrol car pulled away from the Caraway Hotel and turned onto the main road. And for the first stretch of the drive, Wade Pruitt didn't say a word. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes straight ahead, and every time they passed beneath a streetlight, the rearview mirror caught the face of the woman sitting in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her back, her spine straight, her head unbowed. It was that posture that bothered him. People who sat back there usually folded in on themselves. They cried, they cursed, they begged, they asked, "What am I being arrested for?" She did none of those things. She simply sat in silence and looked out the window, as though this were a bus and she were on her way home. So he began to talk, and once he started, he couldn't seem to stop. He talked about this city, said it had rules of its own that no one ever wrote down but everyone was expected to know. He said there were rooms in this life meant for certain people and not for others. That the greatest mistake a person could make wasn't being poor, but forgetting where they were standing. He said he had been doing this job for 16 years, that he had stood outside the doors of hundreds of events like the one tonight, and that one look was enough for him to know who belonged inside and who belonged outside. He kept talking, his voice growing louder and louder, and if anyone had been sitting beside him that night, they would have understood immediately that this wasn't the voice of a man giving a lecture. It was the voice of a man trying to fill the silence, because the silence frightened him. Rosalind didn't answer a single thing he said. She watched the lit windows sliding past outside, the awnings, the signs of restaurants already closed for the night, and she counted the intersections in her head so she would know where he was taking her. She recognized the direction very early. She recognized the name of the street when the car turned left, and for one brief moment something thin and cold passed through her chest, something she had refused to let herself feel for many years. But she said nothing. She waited. It wasn't until the car slowed near the rear gate of the Lyndale precinct, when the headlights swept across the dark brick wall, and Pruitt had just finished another long sentence about people knowing their place, that she finally spoke. She said it very softly, her voice calm, with no accusation in it at all, almost as though she were commenting on the weather. She said that from the moment he entered the ballroom through this entire drive, he hadn't once asked her name. Wade Pruitt burst out laughing. He laughed loudly, harshly, the way someone laughs after hearing the most ridiculous thing they have heard all day. And he told her not to worry, that once they got inside, someone would make sure to write her name very carefully on the paperwork. Then he switched off the engine. But in the instant after his laughter ended, and the sound died completely inside the cramped car, there was one brief second when he couldn't bring himself to look into the rearview mirror again. About 200 yards away, a dark car pulled to the curb and shut off its lights. Bishop had followed from the moment the patrol car left the hotel parking lot. He had called Elias within the first minute, and he had called 4 more times during the drive, but every time all he heard was the steady recorded message saying the phone was turned off. He knew why. He knew his employer was sitting in a conference room in Detroit that night, on a floor where every phone had to be left outside the door, and that negotiation had been 6 months in the making. Bishop got out of the car, walked to the precinct gate, and explained very calmly that he was an acquaintance of the woman who had just been brought inside. The officer at the gate asked what he was to her. Bishop fell silent because he didn't know how to answer truthfully. He wasn't family, wasn't her lawyer, wasn't her friend. He was only a man who had followed her for months to make sure she got home safely, and tonight she had told him to stay outside, and he had done exactly that. The gate closed in front of him. Bishop walked back toward the parking lot, leaned against his car, and stood there for the next 2 hours, his eyes never leaving the brightly lit doorway of the Lyndale precinct. The intake room at the Lyndale precinct on a weeknight was always noisy in its own exhausted way, with the crackle of a radio in the corner, the printer feeding out sheets of paper, and someone in the row of waiting chairs arguing with himself. Behind the high counter sat Sergeant Delia Ruiz, a woman in her 50s, with her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose, and the look of someone who had occupied that exact seat for too many years to be surprised by anything anymore. She looked up when Pruitt brought the woman in, and she had intended to do exactly what she always did: open the form, type a few lines, call a number. But this woman didn't stand the way the others did. She stood straight in front of the counter, her hands already uncuffed and resting neatly on the surface, and she spoke before Ruiz could ask the first question. She said she wanted 3 things. She spoke slowly and clearly, 1 point at a time, her voice barely louder than the radio. First, she asked to make 1 phone call. Second, she asked that the records state that at the hotel that evening, she had requested that the hallway cameras be checked before she was taken away, and that the request had been ignored. Third, she asked for the name and badge number of the officer who had brought her there. Ruiz looked at her over the rims of her glasses. In all the years she had spent behind that counter, she had heard nearly everything people said after walking through that door. People cried, people cursed, people threatened lawsuits, threatened to call attorneys, threatened to get her fired. But no one had ever stood there and recited 3 requests as calmly as though reading from a grocery list. Pruitt cut in before she could answer. He said there would be no phone call until the booking process was finished. He said the matter of the cameras belonged to the hotel, not the precinct, and couldn't be entered into the report. As for the third question, he said nothing at all. He simply stepped half a pace backward and turned slightly, just enough for the nameplate on his chest to disappear into the shadow of the column. All 3 requests were denied. Rosalind nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't plead for anything more. And that was exactly when Delia Ruiz began to feel that something wasn't right. When people were refused, they either collapsed or became furious. This woman did neither. She only nodded, then lifted her eyes and slowly looked around the room, from the clock on the wall, to the numbered label on the filing cabinet, to the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, to the door leading into the holding area. She looked the way someone looks at a room they know they may have to describe later. Ruiz had been sitting there long enough to recognize that look. It wasn't the look of someone who was afraid. It was the look of someone taking notes. Ruiz lowered her eyes to the keyboard, typed a few words, then stopped, and felt something faint stir inside her chest, not yet formed into a thought, only the beginning of a ripple. She asked Pruitt why he had brought the woman in. He answered curtly that it was theft of property at a private event, then added that Ruiz should just write that down and leave the paperwork to him. Across the room, near the coffee machine, a young officer who had only recently joined the force stood holding a cup of cold coffee. He had been there the entire time, and he hadn't taken a single sip. He looked at the woman standing at the counter, then at Pruitt, then down at the floor, and he said nothing. Delia Ruiz remained seated behind the counter for a little while longer, and the uneasiness in her chest didn't fade. It only grew. She looked at the woman standing there, both hands resting on the counter, the left one marked by old scars that Ruiz had deliberately tried not to stare at, and she thought about the way she had just nodded along while all 3 of those requests were denied. Then she pushed the desk phone toward her. She said she could make one call. Pruitt turned to object, but Ruiz gave him a look. The look of someone who had been sitting in this precinct for many years longer than he had, and he closed his mouth. She didn't do it because of procedure. She did it because she felt guilty, and because she wanted that uneasy feeling inside her to go away. Rosalind thanked her. She lifted the receiver, and for reasons no one could quite explain, the entire room seemed to slow for a beat. Pruitt leaned against the counter and waited for her to call a lawyer, because that was what people like her always did. They called some impressive-sounding name, and before long a man in a suit would show up, and the whole thing would turn into the kind of tedious paperwork he already knew how to maneuver around. But she didn't dial any lawyer. She entered a number she knew by heart, her fingertip moving steadily across the buttons, and waited. The phone rang 3 times. Then someone answered, and Rosalind said 7 words. She said, "I'm at Lyndale Precinct. I'm all right." Then she put the receiver down. The entire call lasted no longer than it takes an ordinary person to clear their throat. Pruitt laughed. He asked who she had called. Her mother, and added that if she was planning to have someone come bail her out, she had better tell them to bring money, because it was going to be a long night. Rosalind didn't answer. She drew her hand away from the counter, stepped back once, and stood there in silence, as though the only thing she had needed to do was already done. Delia Ruiz watched her fingers leave the phone, and couldn't understand why a strange thought came into her mind, that people only spoke that briefly, to someone they knew would understand. Nearly 250 miles away, on the highest floor of a glass tower in downtown Detroit, there was a conference room where every phone had to be left in a tray outside the door. On the table lay files that had been prepared over the course of half a year, documents concerning the transfer of a harbor property, the permanent closure of several lines of business his father had left behind, decisions that would mean that from this point forward, the Marchetti family would make money only from things that could be entered openly into ledgers. Elias Marchetti had been sitting in that room for 4 hours, when there was a knock at the door, and someone placed the vibrating phone in his hand. He apologized to the people around the table, stood, and walked toward the window. He listened. The call ended before the people in the room had even had time to turn their attention back to the files in front of them. He placed the phone on the glass tabletop and sat down. Then he stopped moving. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed ahead without looking at anyone, and the silence lasted long enough for one of the men in the room to clear his throat and ask whether he was all right. Elias didn't answer him. He said the meeting ended here, his voice no louder than it had been when he first entered the room and greeted them. In the corner, Emmett Cross straightened. He had been with Elias for nearly a decade, and all it took was that one sentence, together with the fact that his employer had just sat motionless for 7 seconds, for him to understand that before this night was over, someone was going to lose everything. The plane left the runway in Detroit after 10 o'clock that night, and there were only 2 people in the cabin. Elias Marchetti sat in the seat on the left, his coat draped over the back of the chair opposite him, the sleeves of his shirt still holding the sharp creases from the conference room. He didn't read anything. He didn't call anyone. He simply sat looking through the small window, where there was nothing outside but darkness and the faint, scattered lights of towns slipping backward beneath them. And he remained silent like that for 10 full minutes. Emmett Cross sat 2 rows behind him, and in those 10 minutes, he could feel the back of his shirt growing wet with sweat. He would rather have heard his employer shout. He would rather have heard a fist strike the table, a curse, anything that made a sound. But nearly a decade of following this man had taught Emmett one thing, and he had never once seen it prove wrong. When Elias Marchetti stopped talking, it meant he was counting. And when he finished counting, someone was going to lose everything. Then Elias moved. He reached for his phone, dialed the first number, and on the other end, Judith Sable answered on the very first ring, even though it was already close to 11 o'clock at night. He didn't greet her. He told her that his wife was at the Lyndale precinct, that he needed her there before his plane landed, and that from the moment she walked through those doors, not a single piece of paper inside that building was to be allowed to disappear. Mrs. Sable asked him exactly one question, whether anyone had touched her. He said he didn't know yet. She said she was leaving immediately, and she ended the call before he did. His second call was to the fleet manager of the transportation company his family had owned since his grandfather's time, a completely legitimate business with licenses, records, and contracts carrying hotel and airport passengers throughout the south side of the city. Weeknights were their quietest nights. Elias asked how many vehicles were sitting unused in the lot that evening. The man gave him the number. Elias said he wanted every one of them, with drivers in full uniform, parked along both ends of the street in front of the Lyndale precinct before midnight. The man asked what for. Elias said they were only to park there. Engines off, lights on. No one was to step out of a vehicle. No one was to carry anything on their person. And no one was to say a single word to anyone. The man was silent for a moment, then said yes. Elias had barely ended the call when the phone vibrated again in his hand, and this time it was Bishop. The man's voice broke on the very first word. He said he had called 5 times and hadn't gotten through once. He said he had followed them all the way to the precinct gate and had been stopped outside. Then he said the thing he had been holding in his throat for the 2 hours he had stood in that parking lot, that she had told him to stay outside. And he had actually stayed outside. And if only he hadn't listened to her tonight, everything would have been different. Elias let him finish. Then he said, "You listened to my wife, and that was the right thing to do, and I will never blame you for that." He told Bishop to stay exactly where he was and not go anywhere, because people would be arriving soon. Bishop said yes, his voice still trembling. After that call, Elias sat motionless for a little while longer, his thumb moving slowly across the screen. Then he brought up another number. A name appeared, Gus Ferraro. Elias looked at that name for exactly 3 seconds before turning off the screen and placing the phone face down on the table. Emmett saw everything, but he didn't ask. The plane entered a patch of light turbulence, the overhead lights trembling for a few moments before settling again. Emmett moved forward, sat in the row opposite him, and asked the question he had been carrying in his mind for the entire flight. "Who do you want to pay first?" Elias didn't turn around. He continued looking through the small window, where far along the horizon the first lights of the city had begun to gather into a dim, hazy glow. He said, "All of them." Then he added, very quietly, but in the right order. After the woman was taken into the holding cell, Delia Ruiz pulled the gray plastic property tray toward herself to finish the work she should have completed earlier. She emptied its contents onto the counter and began making the inventory. A faded cloth purse, one side of the strap worn nearly through. Inside were a few small bills, folded flat and carefully, the way people fold money they have to count closely every week. A library card from the South Branch, a volunteer identification card from the community center, the photograph slightly blurred, the woman in it turning her face a little to one side, an old model phone, and a small silver brooch shaped like a swallow. Ruiz picked up the brooch to enter it on the final line, then turned it over out of the habit of someone who had been inventorying personal property for decades, because there was almost always something on the back. 2 tiny initials had been engraved into the silver, and beneath them was a symbol. Delia Ruiz had lived on the south side of this city since she was a child. She had walked past those docks. She had seen that symbol on the glass doors of old offices along Halsted Street, on the sides of freight trucks, on the brass plaque mounted outside a restaurant that had been closed for years. She knew it. Everyone in this part of the city knew it. Her finger rested against the silver and didn't move. She turned toward the monitor, opened the county civil records database, and typed in the name Pruitt had given her earlier. The system searched for a moment. Then, a civil marriage record appeared on the screen, dated more than a year earlier, showing the wife's name and, Beside it, the husband's. Delia Ruiz's hands began to tremble. She read the line a second time, then a third, then took off her glasses and read it once more. She looked up. She asked Pruitt who exactly he had put in handcuffs tonight. He didn't raise his head. He was leaning against the column, his thumb sliding up and down the screen of his phone, and he answered curtly that she was just some woman who had stolen a necklace. Who else would she be? Ruiz said the name aloud. She said the first name, the middle name, the surname, and the second family name that followed it, the name the woman had refused to use on any document that could become public, but which still remained there in the county marriage registry. The entire intake room went silent. The printer stopped halfway through, feeding out a sheet of paper. The person in the waiting chairs stopped muttering. In the corner, the coffee cup slipped from the young officer's hand and shattered on the tile floor, and not one person turned to look. Wade Pruitt raised his head very slowly. The blood drained from his face in a way Ruiz had seen only twice in her life. Ruiz didn't look at him again. She turned back to the monitor, opened the precinct intake system, and tried to do the thing she thought might still fix everything. She searched for the case so she could open it, see what had been entered, and begin untangling the situation from there. She entered the date. She entered the shift. She filtered by name. Nothing. She filtered by Pruitt's badge number. Nothing. She filtered by time. The previous hour. Then the previous 2 hours. Nothing. There was no case number. No intake time. Not a single line stating that a woman had been brought through that door tonight. According to the Lindale precinct system, the woman sitting in the holding cell had never entered the building at all. Delia Ruiz straightened in her chair. She had worked the desk long enough to understand immediately what that meant, and the realization went through her colder than the moment she had read the name on the screen. No record meant no clock. No clock meant no deadline by which anyone had to release her. No paperwork that had to be produced. No way for anyone outside to look up where she was. Because on paper, she wasn't anywhere. A person could be kept in the room behind that door until tomorrow morning, until tomorrow afternoon, until the end of Friday. And this wasn't a case of an angry patrol officer arresting the wrong woman at a party. Someone had thought this through beforehand. Ruiz looked toward Pruitt, and she knew one thing with certainty. That mind hadn't come up with this on its own. She lowered her eyes to the tray again. The old phone lay tilted beside the faded purse, and its screen still held a faint glow. Ruiz leaned her head slightly to see it better. On the screen, a small red circle was blinking at a steady rhythm, and beneath it the timer was still counting upward. It had been running since before anyone had entered the ballroom at the Caraway Hotel that night. It was still recording. It had recorded everything. Delia Ruiz rose from her chair, took the ring of keys from the drawer, and walked toward the door leading to the holding cells faster than she had moved in years. The steel door opened with a hard metallic sound. Inside, beneath the white light mounted close to the ceiling, the woman was sitting on the concrete bench, with both hands resting on her lap, her back straight, and she looked up when she heard the keys. Ruiz unlocked the cell. She said she was sorry. She said a very serious mistake had been made there tonight. That she was going to take her out immediately. That she would personally return all of her belongings and call a car to take her home, and that she would handle everything else herself. Ruiz said all of it in a single breath, then stood there holding the door open and waiting. Rosalind didn't get up. She looked at the open door, then at the woman holding it, and asked her one very quiet question. She asked whether, an hour earlier, Ruiz had also been standing behind that counter, whether she had heard Rosalind make 3 requests, and whether all 3 of them had been dismissed. She asked whether anything new had been said since then, whether she had offered any new evidence, whether she had changed even a single word of what she had said before. Ruiz stood motionless. Rosalind continued, her voice no louder than before, saying that Ruiz was listening to her now, not because Rosalind had spoken differently. She was listening because she had just read on the screen whose wife Rosalind was. Ruiz opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't find a single thing to say against that, because it was true, and because both women in that room knew it was true. Then Rosalind asked her a second question, and this was the one that made Delia Ruiz put a hand against the doorframe to steady herself. She asked what happened to everyone who didn't have a husband like hers. She asked how many people, tonight, at that very moment, somewhere in this city, were sitting on benches exactly like the one beneath her, in rooms exactly like this one, and they too had said the right things, and they too had asked for the cameras to be checked, and they too had asked for the name of the person who brought them there, and no one would ever stand up and reach for the keys, because no important name had appeared on a screen. She said that if she walked through that door right now, then tonight would become nothing more than her own private story, and tomorrow everything inside this building would remain exactly as it had been. So she wasn't going to walk out. She would sit there until there was an official report, a case number, an intake time, the name and badge number of the officer who had brought her in, and a clear statement that she had requested the camera footage be checked and that her request had been ignored. She told Ruiz to go write that report, and she would remain right where she was. She wasn't going anywhere. Ruiz stood there in silence for a long time. Then she asked the question she had wanted to ask ever since she saw the small red circle blinking on the screen of the old phone. She asked why it had been running. Rosalind looked down at her hands, her left hand resting over her right the way she often held them, and answered with complete calm. She said she turned it on every time she entered a room full of strangers. She said she had been doing it for years, for so long that her hand did it now, without her mind having to think about it. Then she said one final thing, and there was no bitterness in her voice at all, which was what made it hardest to bear. She said she did it because she knew very well that if something happened in a room like this, between her face and their word, she already knew who people would believe. Delia Ruiz had to turn her face away. Delia Ruiz returned to the counter and began typing. She opened a new report, assigned a case number, entered the intake time, entered Wade Pruitt's name and badge number in the proper field, then added a line stating that the woman who had been brought in had requested that the hotel hallway cameras be checked, and that the request had not been carried out. She printed 2 copies. She had not yet finished signing the second one when the outer door flew open and Captain Roland Sanderson walked in, his coat thrown on so quickly that several buttons were still undone, the hair on the left side of his head flattened from his pillow. He crossed the room without looking at anyone, and the first thing he said when he reached the counter was that Ruiz was to delete everything. He said there was no case, no report, no one had been brought into this building tonight, and she was to destroy the papers in her hands immediately. Ruiz didn't delete anything. She stood there holding the 2 sheets still warm from the printer, and looked at him. Then she asked again in an ordinary voice, the way someone might ask for clarification about some small detail during a shift. "What exactly do you want me to delete?" Sanderson shouted that he meant tonight's case. What else could he mean? Ruiz continued looking at him, then asked the next question in that same calm voice. "But I haven't told you what happened tonight." The room went silent. Roland Sanderson stood frozen in the middle of the intake room with his coat buttoned wrong, and for several seconds he couldn't say a word. He hadn't asked who had been brought in. He hadn't asked what the charge was. He had rushed from his home in the middle of the night, and the first thing he had done was order the destruction of something he shouldn't even have known existed. Delia Ruiz had spent more years behind that counter than he had spent in the captain's office. And in that moment she understood that this night had not begun tonight. She said nothing more. She handed him the first copy, and while he lowered his eyes to read it, she folded the second into quarters and slipped it into the inside pocket of her uniform, slowly, as though putting away a receipt. Sanderson had just lifted his head to start shouting again when the outer door opened once more. A silver-haired woman in her 60s walked in carrying an old leather briefcase and came straight to the counter as though she had walked that path 100 times before. She set the case down, took out a packet of papers, and placed it in front of Sanderson. She introduced herself as Judith Sable. She said this was a formal preservation of evidence notice, lawfully served as of this moment, and she read the exact time aloud, so Ruiz could enter it into the log. Sanderson stared at the document without touching it. "Mrs." Sable told him very slowly to read it carefully, because from the second that paper rested on his desk, every record in that building was protected by law. Then she added that if, after tonight, any sheet of paper disappeared, any line of data was altered, or any recording was overwritten, each one would cease to be an internal precinct matter and would become a separate offense of its own, counted individually against every person who had laid a hand on it. Roland Sanderson put both hands into the pockets of his coat. He didn't do it because he was cold. He did it because he didn't want anyone in the room to see that they were shaking. The first car appeared at the end of the street close to midnight, moving very slowly, and instead of pulling into the parking lot, it stopped along the curb, shut off its engine, and left its headlights on. Then came the second, then the third. They arrived from both ends of the street, one after another, unhurried, without honking, each car easing into an available space before switching off the engine and leaving the lights burning, until there was no room left anywhere along the street, in front of the Lyndale precinct, for another vehicle to fit. 47 cars, painted black, all with valid license plates, all legally parked on a public street at an hour when the law prohibited no one from being there. The drivers remained behind their steering wheels in uniform coats. Not a single door opened. Not one person stepped out. Not a word was spoken. There was only the light. dozens of pairs of headlights crossing one another, throwing a cold white glare against the dark brick walls of the police station, until every window seemed illuminated as brightly as midday. Bishop had been there before all of them. He had spent 2 hours leaning against his own car, and when the first vehicle arrived, he simply stepped back to make room, then remained exactly where he was, his eyes never leaving the brightly lit doorway. Behind the line of cars, across the street, 2 television news vans had somehow already raised their transmission masts, and behind the reporters stood people from Bridgeport, more arriving every few minutes. Her neighbors, parents of the children from the church basement, owners of the small restaurants along the street. They weren't chanting, they weren't holding signs. They simply stood on the sidewalk in silence, and many of them held phones at chest height. Roland Sanderson stood inside the intake room and lifted one corner of the window curtain to look out. For the first few seconds he waited for noise, waited for someone to pound on the doors, waited for shouting, but there was nothing outside except light and silence, and that was what sent the chill down his spine. He understood that his precinct wasn't being attacked. No one was going to rush the building. No one was going to do anything illegal. He was being watched. The entire city had been invited to stand outside and look into this building. The front door opened at that moment, and a man walked in alone. He carried nothing in his hands. His coat was open, and the sleeves of his shirt still held the creases of a conference room, nearly 250 miles away. He crossed the intake room slowly, and the officers standing there moved aside without anyone telling them to. Sanderson stepped forward to block his path. He said he was the captain here. He said Elias had no right to enter. He said something about this being a city police facility. Elias Marchetti stopped. He looked at the man in front of him for a moment, then spoke, and his voice was so quiet that Sanderson had to lean slightly toward him to hear. Elias said Sanderson's son worked for the transportation company on Halsted Street. He said that company belonged to his family, and had belonged to his family since his grandfather's time. Then he said he wasn't telling him that as a threat. He was telling him so Sanderson would understand one thing. Tonight, Elias knew more about Sanderson's family than Sanderson knew about Elias's wife, and Elias still wasn't going to touch a single one of them. He said that was the difference between the two of them. Roland Sanderson stepped back half a pace, and he didn't say anything else. Elias continued forward. Delia Ruiz had already opened the steel door leading to the holding area and was standing to one side. Inside, beneath the white light mounted close to the ceiling, Rosalind was still sitting on the concrete bench exactly where she had been from the beginning, both hands resting on her lap, her back straight. Elias walked up to the bars. Then he lowered himself to his knees, both knees touching the concrete floor, so that his eyes were level with hers. The man whose entrance could make an entire neighborhood on the south side of the city rise to its feet knelt on the concrete floor of a holding cell, and the first thing he said wasn't directed at the captain standing frozen behind him, nor at anyone else in that building. He spoke to her. He said, "I'm sorry I let you sit here alone for so long." Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, while Rosalind was sitting in Judith Sable's office signing each page of the statement, Elias's phone vibrated, and Emmett Cross's voice on the other end managed only one sentence, that Mr. Gus had sent men to the officer's house. Elias asked how long ago. Emmett said about 20 minutes. Elias stood up in the middle of the unfinished conversation, took his keys, and drove there himself without bringing anyone with him. Throughout the drive, he didn't think about Wade Pruitt. He thought about his father's cousin, the man in his 60s who was the last remaining figure from the old generation, the man who had fought him for 3 years since Elias began shutting down one branch of the family business after another, the man who still described what Elias was doing with a single word that no one in the family dared repeat in front of him. That word was betrayal. Pruitt's house stood in a row of low homes at the western edge of Lyndale, behind a chain-link fence, with one of the porch lights burned out. By the time Elias arrived, a car was already parked across the street, and 4 men were standing on the sidewalk outside the gate, while Gus Ferraro leaned against the hood with both hands in the pockets of his coat, looking like an old man who had stepped outside for a little air in the middle of the night. Elias parked his car across the entrance, got out, and walked directly into the space between those 4 men and the gate to the house. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't raise his voice. He only said that no one was going into that house tonight. Gus laughed, the rough laugh of a man who had smoked for too many years, and said that their family had one rule, only one, that no one touched a woman belonging to this family, that Elias's father had lived and died by that rule, and tonight Elias had called a lawyer. He asked whether Elias knew what people all over the neighborhood were saying about him now. Elias let him finish. Then he said that if anything happened tonight, to the man inside that house, by morning, Wade Pruitt would no longer be a bad police officer who had put handcuffs on the wrong woman. He would become a police officer who had been retaliated against. People would mourn him, flags would be lowered, and no one would talk anymore about the report he had written years earlier. Elias said that tonight the entire city was standing in the street, looking into a building, and beginning to ask questions. And all it would take was one thing happening here, for every one of those questions to turn in another direction, and from that moment forward his wife would never again be the woman who had been wronged. She would be the wife of the man who had struck back. He said Gus was about to take away the only thing she had. Gus spat onto the curb and said Elias talked too much. Then he jerked his head toward the 4 men and told them to go inside. 2 of them turned and started walking back toward the car, but the other 2 didn't. They remained where they were, looking at Gus rather than Elias. And in that very brief moment, beneath the headlights of 2 cars crossing one another on an empty street at 2 o'clock in the morning, Elias Marchetti's authority was openly challenged for the first time in 3 years. He didn't shout. He didn't step forward. He simply took his phone from his coat pocket, dialed a number, turned on the speaker, and held it at chest height so everyone on that street could hear. The phone rang twice. Then an elderly woman's voice came through, hoarse from having just been awakened. The last surviving woman of the generation that had built the Marchetti name in that neighborhood, Gus Ferraro's own mother. Elias said exactly one sentence to her. That Auntie, I'm standing outside a house Uncle Gus wants to enter. There were 3 seconds of silence on the other end. Then the old woman said one short, dry sentence in Italian, in the voice of a mother speaking to her 61-year-old son. Then she hung up. On the sidewalk, all 4 men turned away at once without looking at one another, and they walked straight back to the car. Gus Ferraro remained standing alone beneath the headlights, both hands still buried in his coat pockets, and he didn't watch them leave. Elias stepped closer and said the final thing of that night very quietly, only loud enough for the 2 of them to hear. He said that Gus would keep his house, keep his money, keep his name, and no one in this family would ever be allowed to touch him, not even Elias. Then he said the rest. From tonight forward, no one in this family would listen to him anymore. Elias turned his back and walked toward his car. Behind him, the older man remained standing there for a very long time beneath the white light cutting across the empty street, alone. The hallway footage from the Caraway Hotel was retrieved the very next morning, and it showed that the necklace had never left the building. Corinne Ashford's own assistant had placed it in the safe half an hour before Corinne raised the alarm about where it had gone. But by then, no one cared about the necklace anymore. That afternoon, Wade Pruitt was taken into a small room on the 2nd floor with a metal table and 2 chairs, and he sat there for nearly an hour before the door opened. The person who entered wasn't a police officer. She was a silver-haired woman in her 60s, carrying an old leather briefcase, and she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without saying hello. She opened the case, took out a thin file, then removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table, turning it around so he could read it easily. The paper had yellowed at all 4 corners, thin carbon copy paper of the kind no one had used in more than a decade. It was a handwritten incident report. Wade Pruitt looked down and recognized his own handwriting before he had even read a single word. Mrs. Sable said nothing. She simply sat there and let him read. At the top of the page was the address of a lodging complex called Bellamy, a row of low-rent apartments on the eastern edge of Lyndale, sitting squarely within the jurisdiction of the very precinct where he had worked for 16 years. In the middle of the page was the preliminary conclusion, written in language he had used thousands of times before, stating that the cause had been determined to be accidental, resulting from resident negligence. Beneath that was a notation that someone had not made it out that night, and in the lower right corner, beneath his own hurried signature, was the approval signature of the sergeant on duty at the time, a name that now appeared on the plaque outside the captain's office on the 3rd floor at the end of the hallway. Roland Sanderson. He read down to the 3rd line. On the 3rd line was the name of a witness, and beside that name was a short notation, also written in his own hand, stating that the witness was in shock, her account inconsistent, unusable. Rosalind Whitaker. Wade Pruitt sat motionless for a very long time. Then his hands began to tremble, and he lowered them into his lap to hide it. But it was already too late. For all those years he had thought of that name as nothing more than a name, something buried somewhere inside a stack of old papers, and he had feared it the way people fear a debt when they can no longer remember exactly how much they owe. Now, sitting in front of that sheet of paper, he finally saw the whole thing. He remembered that night. He remembered the smell of smoke clinging to his collar long after he had gone home. He remembered where he had been standing, directly in front of the entrance, one arm raised to block the way, and he remembered shouting into the face of a very young woman, telling her to go back, telling her to stay where she was, and he remembered that she hadn't listened to him. He remembered that she had gone past him. That night, he had written one line into the report to make everything neat, and the next morning Sergeant Sanderson had signed off on it, and the case had been closed in less than 2 weeks, and for all those years, no one had ever opened it again. He didn't remember her face. He had told himself over and over that he didn't remember her face. But the night before last, when that name came through the phone, he had sat in his patrol car and his hand had begun to shake exactly as it was shaking now, and he had walked into that ballroom not to clean up anyone's problem, but to make certain that no one would ever believe that woman again. He looked up at Mrs. Sable, and the only thing he could manage was a stammered question, asking whether she knew. Mrs. Sable closed the file and said that until this morning, she hadn't. Then she added that now she did. She stood, picked up her briefcase, and before leaving, paused for a moment at the door. She said that all these years he had been afraid of that name, and he had never even bothered to find out how the person carrying it had lived. Then she closed the door behind her. Wade Pruitt remained alone in that room, with the yellowed sheet of paper lying open in front of him, and for the first time in many years, there was no longer any way for him not to think about it. That afternoon, Rosalind sat in Judith Sable's office, while the older woman explained what would happen next, and Mrs. Sable spread an entire file across the desk in front of her. Rosalind turned the pages very slowly. There was a copy of the handwritten incident report. There was a record of complaints involving the Lyndale precinct over the years. There was a diagram tracing money flowing from companies connected to Harlan Voss, and in the lower corner of every page, stamped in blue ink that had already begun to fade, was the date the file had been opened. She stared at that date for a long time. It was from months earlier. She asked Mrs. Sable, who had instructed her to build this file. Mrs. Sable's hand paused for a single beat, and that one beat was enough. That evening, Rosalind returned to the apartment in Bridgeport, and Elias was in the kitchen as he always was. She placed the file on the dining table between them, and she didn't sit down. She asked how long he had known. He turned off the stove. He said for months. She asked why he hadn't told her. He said because if he had told her, she would have demanded to testify that very day, and at the time he hadn't yet been able to protect her. She stood still for a moment, then asked another question in the same ordinary voice, where the original handwritten report was. He didn't answer immediately. She said Mrs. Sable had told her the original had never been digitized, that there was only one copy in the entire city, and it was kept in the basement archives. Then she said the name of the building with that basement, the Lyndale precinct. Elias stood with his back to the stove, a dish towel still in one hand, and he didn't turn around. She continued. She said that on that night he had sent 47 cars to line both ends of the street, and the entire city had stood outside watching. And for the whole night, not one person inside that building had dared go down to the basement and do anything to any piece of paper. She said, "I thought you came because of me." He set the towel down. He said, "I did come because of you." She said, "I know." Then she said the rest, and she didn't raise her voice. There were no tears, and that made it heavier than any shouting could have been. She said, "But you also came because of that piece of paper." She said that on the night I was sitting on that concrete bench, there were 2 things in your mind, and I was only one of them. Elias turned around. He said he wasn't going to deny that. She asked the next question very slowly, separating each word as though she were laying bricks one by one. She asked, "If I hadn't been your wife that night, if I had only been a name in that file, a name on the 3rd line, someone who knew no one, belonged to no one, and was sitting in that exact same room, would you still have sent those 47 cars?" Elias didn't answer. The kitchen remained silent for a very long time. Outside the window, a car passed, and then the sound faded completely away. He opened his mouth once and stopped. He opened it a second time, and this time he spoke. He said, "I don't know." She looked at him. He continued, saying that he could sit there and tell her yes, of course I would have, and she would believe him, and tonight they would eat dinner together, the way they did every night. But he didn't know, and he wasn't going to lie to her about that. He said he had been raised in a house where people only acted for their own, and he had spent 3 years dismantling that house piece by piece, but there were things inside him he still hadn't managed to take apart. Then he said the last thing. He said that was something he would have to live with for the rest of his life, not her. Rosalind stood there for a long time. Then she nodded, very slightly, and said, "Thank you for not lying to me." She said, "I'm not angry that you kept that file for months. I'm angry because for all those months, you held my life in your hands. You read it. You arranged it. You calculated when to use it, and you never asked me a single question, she said. You don't have the right to decide when I'm allowed to know what I lost. He said nothing. He didn't follow her. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say another word. Rosalind took her coat from the hook, pinned the small silver swallow brooch to her collar with her awkward left hand, and walked to the door. She paused at the threshold for exactly 1 beat. Then she left. For the next 3 days, Elias Marchetti didn't leave the apartment in Bridgeport. He slept on the couch in the living room, cooked meals for one person and left them untouched. And he didn't call her even once. That was the part Emmett Cross found hardest to understand. This was a man who could make one phone call and have 47 cars appear on any street in the city before midnight. Yet for 3 days, he couldn't bring himself to dial a number he knew better than his own address. On the morning of the 3rd day, Emmett came over, placed a file on the dining table, and sat down across from him. He said Harlan Voss was moving assets out. He said that if they allowed him to finish, then even if they won in court, there would be nothing left to recover, and the community center in the church basement would still have to close, because there would be no one left to cover the funding that had been withdrawn. Then he said the rest more slowly, without lifting his eyes from the table. He said there was a way to stop it. He said it wasn't in any of Mrs. Sable's files, that it didn't require a court, didn't require a signature, didn't require waiting until Friday. It was the old way. It was the way Elias's father had used, and his grandfather before him, and it would be finished in a single night. Emmett said nothing more. He simply pushed the file across the table and waited. Elias opened it. He read very slowly, page after page, and Emmett watched him linger over one page near the middle. Then Elias closed it. Then he opened it again. In that narrow kitchen, the clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily, and outside the window the brick wall of the building next door looked exactly as it did every morning. Elias reached for the pen in the pocket of the coat, draped over the back of the chair. He picked it up, removed the cap, and held it there. Emmett didn't breathe. He had followed this man for nearly a decade, and he knew very well that not once in the past 3 years had Elias's hand touched a document like the one lying in front of him now. Then Elias looked up. He didn't look at Emmett. He looked through the kitchen doorway, toward the corner of the living room by the wall, where an old piano stood beneath a cloth cover, its lid closed. He had bought it during the first month after they married. He had hired men to carry it up 3 flights of narrow wooden stairs, had paid to have every key tuned, and she had stood there watching for the entire afternoon without saying anything. She had thanked him. Then she had covered it with the cloth, and in all the months since, she had never once opened the lid. Elias looked at that piano for a very long time. Then he put the cap back on the pen. He pushed the file across the table toward Emmett and said no. Emmett asked why. Not because he wanted to argue, but because he truly wanted to understand. Elias said she would know. He said maybe not this week, maybe not for another year, but eventually she would know. She always knew. Then he said the rest very quietly, his eyes still fixed on the far corner of the room. He said that if the day came when she found out, she would never open the lid of that piano again. Emmett picked up the file, stood, and walked toward the door. When he reached the steps, he turned back once. Elias was still sitting exactly where he had been, both hands resting on the empty table, inside the kitchen of a woman who had not come home in 3 days. On Thursday afternoon, Rosalind came out of the basement of St. Bridget Church after teaching her final class of the week and sat down on the stone steps along the side of the building to wait for the 4 o'clock bus. A gray car was parked across the street, and when she sat down, its door opened. Harlan Voss crossed the street alone, carrying nothing in his hands, and asked whether she minded if he sat down. She said the steps didn't belong to her. He sat a short distance away, folded the hem of his coat neatly over his knees, and began by talking about the center. He said he had looked through the books. He said the funding the Ashford Foundation had been sending here was, in reality, his money and had been for years, and that if he stopped it, the center would survive another 2 months, perhaps 3 if they were careful. He said the room downstairs would close, the old piano would be sold or thrown away, and the children who still came here on Tuesday afternoons would go home and sit there instead. He said all of it in the voice of a man presenting a budget estimate, placing no special emphasis on any word and threatening no one. Then he took a check from the inside pocket of his coat, already filled out and folded in half, and placed it on the stone step between them. He said the amount was enough to keep the center running until those children reached college. He said it was enough for her to buy an apartment, enough for her never to have to ride a bus again. He said he wasn't asking her to lie about anything. He was only asking her not to be there tomorrow morning. That was all. Don't be there. Rosalind looked down at the folded check on the stone step. Then she opened the faded cloth purse resting on her lap and turned it so he could see inside. There were a few small bills folded carefully flat. There was the library card. There was the volunteer identification card with the photograph taken in profile. She said this was everything she owned, and this was how much she had lived with for years. She said he was thinking that someone like her would be easy. Then she said this was where he was wrong, that a person who had lived on this little for so many years wasn't someone easy to buy, but someone who had grown used to having nothing to lose. She closed the purse, placed it back on her lap, and said she would be there tomorrow morning. Harlan Voss didn't become angry. He didn't raise his voice, didn't spring to his feet, didn't offer another threat. He only nodded several times, like a man who had received an answer he didn't want but hadn't truly found surprising, then picked up the check and returned it to his coat pocket. He sat there in silence for a while, looking down the hill in front of them. Then he spoke again, his voice just as calm as when he had been discussing the accounts. He said that on the night that building burned, he had sat down with his people and calculated everything very carefully. He said there had been one column listing what could be lost, and in that column were insurance costs, lawsuits, compensation payments, and several smaller lines near the bottom. He said her name had been on one of those small lines. Then he said the final part, and he didn't say it cruelly at all, which was what made it almost unbearable. He said the number beside her name had been so small that he had never needed to remember it, and in all the years since, he had never once thought about it until the night he saw her standing on that stage. He stood, brushed off the front of his coat, and crossed the street back to his car. Rosalind remained alone on the stone steps. The 4 o'clock bus arrived exactly on time. She didn't stand. She let it pass. After that night, the youngest officer at the Lyndale precinct was given a job no one else wanted, to go down into the basement and review the entire archive under the evidence preservation order. His name was Teddy Lamb. He had been on the force for less than 6 months, and he was the one who had dropped the coffee cup in the intake room that night. The archive sat at the end of a hallway that smelled of damp paper, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, with metal shelves as tall as a person arranged in narrow rows. He worked down there for 2 full days, opening box after box and checking each file number against the list in his hand. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, he found that box. Inside was the file on a lodging complex called Bellamy, the paper yellowed with age, the string around it crumbling when he touched it. He sat down on the concrete floor between 2 rows of shelves and opened the file because he needed to enter its number on the list. He read the handwritten incident report. He read the 3rd line, where the witness's name appeared, the same name everyone in the precinct had been talking about for the past 2 days. Then he turned to the next page, the list of residents from the lodging complex, and ran his finger down the column of names until it stopped. His mother's name was there, and directly beneath it was his own, followed by his age at the time. Teddy Lamb sat motionless for a long time between those rows of metal shelves. He didn't remember much about that night. He only remembered getting outside, remembered the red and blue lights sweeping across the pavement, and remembered his mother holding him tightly on the other side of the fence. His mother had told him about it only once, when he was in middle school, and then she never spoke of it again. She had only said that a girl had brought him out, and that the girl had been very young. She didn't know her name. For all those years, Teddy had thought of it as a story belonging to his family, something finished, something from another place. He sat there on the concrete floor with the resident list in his hands, and then he remembered something else. He remembered the night before last inside the ballroom at the Caraway Hotel, when Wade Pruitt had made that remark about the face of the woman standing near the back wall. Teddy had taken half a step forward. He remembered that half step clearly, remembered his left foot lifting from the marble floor. Then he had stopped. He had been on the force for less than 6 months. He still had student loans, and his mother had only recently stopped working. He had remained exactly where he was and said nothing. And afterward, he had stood in the corner of the intake room with a cup of cold coffee in his hand and said nothing there either. The next morning, Teddy Lamb brought the entire file to Judith Sable and told her he would testify. She asked whether he had thought it through carefully. He said he had. He testified about what he had seen in the ballroom, about what he had heard in the intake room, about the fact that no record had been created, and about what his captain had ordered close to midnight. 3 weeks later, he received a letter terminating his probationary employment, with the reason listed simply as not a suitable fit. The following Tuesday afternoon, he went to the basement of St. Bridget Church. He stood at the bottom of the stairs until the lesson was over, waited until all the children had gone, and only then stepped inside. Rosalind was closing the lid of the old piano. She looked up at him and asked who he was looking for. Teddy Lamb gave his name. Then he said the name Bellamy. She went still, one hand still resting on the piano lid. He said, "You don't remember me." "I know," he said. "I was too young that night, and I don't remember your face either. I never even knew your name until last week." Then he said the rest, very slowly, because he had been practicing the words for days on his way there. He said, "But I still remember your hand." He said, "I remember the way you held mine, how tightly you held it, so tightly that I still remember it even now." He said, "All these years I thought it was only a child's dream." Rosalind said nothing. She looked down at her left hand, the hand that no stranger had asked her about in all those years. Then she asked whether he would sit down and have a cup of tea with her. On Friday morning, Rosalind Whitaker arrived at the Federal Building on an early bus, carrying a shoebox with her. The box was old, its corners crushed, the lid held shut by a brittle rubber band. Mrs. Judith Sable walked beside her all the way down the corridor and never asked what was inside. When the door to the grand jury room opened and Rosalind stepped through, a young woman seated in the witness section stood up. Only one person. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there with both arms at her sides, her eyes fixed on Rosalind, and she remained standing until Rosalind had walked past the entire row and taken the chair positioned in the middle of the room. Only then did the young woman sit down again. The prosecutor began with questions about the night at the Caraway Hotel, then about the Lyndale precinct, then about what had been entered into the record and what had not. Rosalind answered each question one at a time, briefly, adding nothing more than she was asked. Near the end, the prosecutor asked her about the Bellamy lodging complex and said that according to the file, her statement at the time had been described as inconsistent, and asked whether she wanted to say anything about that. Rosalind said yes. She said that she had been 19 years old then, that she had been an orphan, that she had spent 4 months in the hospital, and that there had been no one standing behind her to speak a single word on her behalf. She said she had given a statement. She had given it to 2 people in uniform at her hospital bedside, and she had told them exactly what she was about to say here today. Then the case had been closed in less than 2 weeks, and for all those years no one had opened it again. She said she had not been silent all those years. She had simply spoken at a time when no one stood behind her, so the words she gave became nothing more than a line inside a file. She placed the shoebox on the table in front of her. She said that when she was discharged from the hospital, they returned the bag containing her personal belongings, and inside it, along with her clothes, was something the medical staff had removed from her hand on the night she was brought into the emergency department. She said she had put it in this box, had carried it with her through 7 different places she had lived, and had never once opened it. She removed the rubber band. She lifted the lid. Inside was a length of iron chain and a padlock. The metal had darkened with age and twisted out of shape, and the lock was bent on one side and still closed. She placed them on the table beside the box. The entire room fell silent. Rosalind said that the emergency exit on the 2nd floor of that building had been locked from the outside. She said it had been kept that way long before the night of the fire, for a long time, to prevent people from getting inside and staying there without permission, and that everyone who lived in the building knew it, and they had reported it, and no one had done anything. She said the door that was supposed to open had been locked, and she had torn it loose with her bare hands. She raised her left hand. She didn't hold it high. She only placed it palm up on the table beneath the lights of the room. She said that for all these years, people had looked at that hand and invented their own story about it. Some thought she had been in an accident. Some thought she had done something foolish. Some called her reckless, said she should never have run back inside, and they said it in a tone that made it sound as though what happened had somehow been her fault. She said it wasn't. She said she didn't carry that scar because she had been reckless. She carried it because there had been a door that was supposed to open, and it had been locked, and because for years before that night, people had known it was locked and had chosen to do nothing. Then she said the final thing, very softly, and no one in the room moved. She said the evidence had been right there on that hand all these years. It had never been hidden. It had been there every day, on her body, and people had seen it at bus stops, in stores, in hospital corridors, and in a ballroom filled with people that night. Everyone had seen it. No one had ever asked. The prosecutor had to wait for a moment before she could ask the next question. She asked whether anyone besides Rosalind had gone through that door that night. Rosalind said there had been 2 others. The prosecutor asked where they were now. Rosalind turned toward the witness section, where a young woman had stood when she entered the room, and said that one of them was studying nursing and was here this morning. Then she said that the other had lost his job the week before because he had testified against his fellow officers. Harlan Voss was indicted on a series of charges, connected to the Bellamy lodging complex, and to attempting to bribe a person who was preparing to testify. His assets were frozen before he could move them away, and none of the people who had once sat beside him at fundraising dinners would answer his calls anymore. Corinne Ashford pleaded guilty to making false statements. The foundation bearing her family name was dissolved within a week, and she sat alone in the very ballroom where she had once been the center of everything, signing the last of the papers. Wade Pruitt lost his job, lost the entire pension he had built over 16 years, and was charged with depriving another person of her rights under color of law, along with offenses connected to what he had written in that report many years earlier. Roland Sanderson was charged with obstruction of justice and financial corruption regarding the money that had flowed through the Lyndale precinct for years without ever appearing in any official ledger. Delia Ruiz, meanwhile, lost nearly all of her friends on the force. People stopped greeting her in the parking lot. They stopped asking her to join them for coffee. But she kept her job, and more than a year later, when the Lyndale precinct was rebuilt from the ground up, she was chosen to lead the newly created Internal Oversight Division. She accepted the position, and the first thing she did was order every intake form reprinted, with one additional field that could never be left blank: the name of the person being brought in. The following spring, the basement of St. Bridget Church had a new room. The space had been renovated, the floor replaced, the walls soundproofed, and several pianos stood inside still carrying the scent of fresh wood. The funding came from an anonymous source, and no one at the center knew who it was, although the director joked that she had a fairly good guess. On opening day, the center held a small ceremony and invited Rosalind to finally receive the award she had never gotten to accept that night. They had prepared a new certificate for her, freshly printed and neatly framed. She refused it. She said she wanted the old one. Someone had to go looking for it, and eventually it was found in a cabinet at the Caraway Hotel. The frame cracked at one corner, the glass marked by a clear shoe print across the middle. Rosalind held that certificate in her hands and stood before a room full of people, with several children in the front row nudging one another and giggling, parents lining the walls, and Mrs. Ruiz sitting in one corner in ordinary clothes. Rosalind spoke very briefly. She said there had been 300 people in that ballroom that night. She said she wasn't angry with any of them, because for so many years she herself had lowered her eyes whenever someone looked at her. Then she said that on that night, she hadn't needed anyone to come save her. She had only needed one person out of those 300 to walk over and ask her name. She set the certificate down and walked to the piano in the middle of the room. She sat, adjusted the bench, and placed both hands on the keys, her right hand and her left. She tapped twice on the piano lid the way she had done on so many Tuesday afternoons. Then she began to play. The first notes came slowly and unevenly, and in the fourth measure one note fell short. She didn't stop. She kept playing, and by the middle of the piece her left hand had begun to keep pace, while the room had grown so quiet that they could hear the new wood of the piano itself settling beneath the sound. The children in the front row didn't move. Every one of them tilted their heads slightly to one side, in the way of people who listen with their ears. One mother, standing against the wall, raised a hand to cover her mouth. In the last row, close to the entrance, a man sat alone, unnoticed by everyone around him. He didn't move once during the entire piece. Then he lowered his head and cried, in a place where other people could see him, for the first time in his life. When the ceremony ended, people drifted outside into the churchyard. Elias remained in the hallway waiting for someone, and when Teddy Lamb passed by, he called him over. He didn't say much. He asked whether Teddy intended to continue his education. Teddy said he had thought about law school, but that would have to wait a few years. Elias said that Teddy had taken half a step forward and then stopped, and he said that he himself had stopped more times than Teddy could imagine. Then he said that today he would pay the debt for both of them. 3 weeks later, Teddy Lamb received a letter informing him that he had been awarded a full scholarship from a foundation he had never heard of, and even years later, he would never know who had been behind it. That afternoon, the two of them walked home together, down the hill in front of the church, and onto the familiar streets of Bridgeport, past the bakery that had already closed for the day, and the lamppost with the peeling paint that Rosalind still used as a landmark whenever she came home late. They still lived in the same third-floor apartment, with its narrow hallway, wooden stairs that creaked beneath every step, and a kitchen window facing the brick wall of the building next door. She had never wanted to move, and he had never asked her about it again. That evening, Elias rolled up his sleeves and cooked dinner the way he always did, while Rosalind sat in the only chair in the kitchen, the small silver swallow brooch still pinned to her collar. By then, nearly everyone in the neighborhood knew what that brooch meant, but that wasn't where the real change was. The real change was that when strangers looked at her at the bus stop, she no longer lowered her eyes. She looked back at them, and she greeted them first. This story leaves us with something very simple. The worth of a human being doesn't lie in the face they carry, the clothes they wear, or the name standing behind them. There are people who carry on their bodies the marks of a moment when they chose to do the right thing, and yet they spend their whole lives being judged by those very marks. And the only thing any of us needs to do when we see someone being treated unfairly right in front of us is refuse to look away. Sometimes people don't need to be rescued. Sometimes all a person needs is for someone to walk up and ask their name. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. Tell us how you feel about Rosalind, about the choice she made, and about the people who remained silent in that ballroom that night by leaving a few words in the comments, because we truly hope to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, and may every day bring you peace, happiness, and serenity. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.